Prime Minister Mark Carney has a jam-packed schedule in London today, meeting with business and political leaders, all part of a push to attract investment and bolster Canada's ties with other countries amid tensions with the United States.
Mark Carney walked into that London press conference, and instead of dodging questions, he came out swinging. Reporters pressed him on what Canada had actually achieved, and Carney shot back fast. He pointed to deals in Mexico and Europe, and a first-ever bilateral trade pact with Indonesia that cuts or eliminates tariffs on 95% of Canadian exports headed there. That's not abstract diplomacy, that's numbers on the board. The tone was elbows up, no apology, no backing down. But the press conference didn't stop at trade. It turned into a showdown over tariffs and Canada's role in Ukraine. Carney versus reporters, elbows up. In the room, the real flashpoint started the moment questions began. Jeremy from CTV opened by asking whether the trip had produced anything tangible at all, framing it as though Canada had sunk time, money, and political capital for nothing.
Sorry, that was in addition to the English answer. It's not just to, je vais continuer, mais it's not just you sign a nice agreement and then something happens. No, you actually have to do the work.
That framing mattered. It boxed Carney in before he even had the chance to define success for himself. Carney didn't backpedal or smooth the edges. His reply landed hard. He answered with a blunt list of deals and progress, leaving little room for the no results narrative. Mexico, New York, Ottawa, then the capstone, the Indonesia trade agreement pitched as a direct breakthrough worth headlines on its own. It was clipped, fast, and sharp, delivered like a stacked set of stats meant to settle the score on the spot. That Indonesia point stood apart. He underscored it not as a minor side note, but as a decisive answer. This wasn't a vague promise of future negotiations. It was presented as a signed piece of evidence. The effect was unmistakable. Carney wasn't conceding the premise, he was erasing it. Listen to the style, because it was different from what we usually hear.
A company is not viable, any organization not viable, if it has cost $5 billion over the course of the last decade, if it's losing $10 million a day.
Instead of dressing his words in soft metaphors like building momentum, he reached straight for blunt assertions. No hedging, no apology. It had the feel of a hockey player pressing back with elbows when crowded too close. Most diplomats skate around friction, as if the job is to glide seamlessly without making contact. Carney went the other way. He created the space he needed by driving through it. That shift was significant because it broke with the familiar Canadian tradition of caution in these moments. Reporters have grown used to leaders softening ambition with polite qualifiers, almost apologizing for saying Canada achieved something. Seeing Carney go on offense jolted the room. The questions weren't ignored. He took them, but each was met with numbers, examples, and, when necessary, a counterpunch.
Ceasefire, not your question, but in a ceasefire situation, one of the most important things will be to scale up that activity even more, because the first line of defense will be a reinforced Ukrainian army, regardless of the nature of the ceasefire or any peace agreement. So that's the.
What it showed was more than the policy details. It revealed his willingness to challenge the frame itself. The press wanted him to defend empty outcomes. He flipped it into a claim of measurable wins. That project's strength, but it comes with a risk too. Assertiveness reads as authority to some, as arrogance to others. Closing that much space on the media carries both possibilities. Still, the impression was fixed almost immediately. Carney, forceful, unapologetic, unafraid of confrontation. He looked less like a mediator, more like an enforcer, making sure no one wrote the story over him. That exchange set the tone, and it was only the warm-up for the tariff showdown to come. Tariffs, Trump, and the fight for Canada's turf. Tariffs were the real weight in London, not just diplomatic jabs. Trump's trade wars had already hammered Canada. Steel first, aluminum dragged along, even pharmaceuticals thrown into the mix. It was Washington reminding Ottawa who carried leverage. Asked whether these measures might weaken Canadian strength, Carney didn't flinch. He said Canada would respond elbow for elbow. The phrase cut through because it was direct, but it came with context. Retaliation would be targeted and strategic, not the kind of blanket escalation that risks collateral damage.
Well, Canada will do our bit. that ultimately some form of U.S. backstop to any security guarantee of Ukraine that is provided by the coalition of the willing.
Carney also noted something more cautious. Ottawa hadn't actually seen the formal U.S. tariff details. No executive order, no release text. Without that, he hesitated to be definitive, but the message was clear. Once those details landed, Canada would match pressure with equal force. He framed retaliation as sharp and precise, meant to sting without blowing up the wider trade relationship.
What have you decided?
Well, it's not. First point, it's not for us to decide that future. It's for us to support and influence in the ways we can.
The stakes on the ground were obvious. Tariffs on steel and aluminum meant real risks for Canadian workers who rely on those sectors, and families who shoulder the consequences through prices and lost incomes. That wasn't theory. It went straight to voters in Ontario, Alberta, and the port cities tied to heavy industry. Reporters pressed him with that vulnerability, hinting that retaliation could backfire. Carney dismissed it in an instant, calling the concern a rounding error. That phrase hit hard because it flattened the premise, suggesting the damage was nowhere near what critics wanted to suggest. And he underscored why. Canada was, in fact, one of the very few countries still carrying select retaliatory tariffs in certain areas, like steel and autos, while continuing negotiations.
Let me be absolutely clear, though, just for the avoidance of doubt. We didn't. The discussions I had in New York and here are discussions about the overall investment climate, not specific transactions or investment deals. Is how is Canada perceived? What are the global trends?
In Carney's framing, Ottawa wasn't passive, and it wasn't reckless. Responses were already calibrated into Canada's trade posture. Pharmaceuticals added another layer. Carney pointed out that most of Canada's exports to the U.S. in that sector are generics. Those products face lower regulatory barriers, thinner margins, and less exposure to punitive impact. A tariff in that category might seem dramatic in headlines, but would land softer blows in practice. By stressing this, he punctured the narrative of looming collapse, showing again that while the risks existed, they weren't fatal. The picture he painted was a deliberate strategy, not a fight spiraling out of control. Retaliation when required, precision to limit the blowback, and a readiness to carry tariffs of his own into negotiations as leverage. Carney positioned toughness as calculation, not theater, responding with strength but keeping balance. And with the tariff fight framed this way, he pivoted from defense to offense. The conversation widened beyond trade, connecting Canada's economic resilience to questions of domestic strength and international role. From housing to security commitments, he began mapping out a broader agenda that stretched well past tariffs into how Canada could project confidence at home and abroad. From housing to Ukraine, the enforcer's agenda. Carney's message in London widened beyond tariffs into what sounded like a full governing agenda. He drew a straight line from domestic priorities to Canada's commitments abroad, presenting both as parts of a single playbook. The focus stretched from housing and family incomes at home to security and alliance work overseas, structured as one unified plan rather than separate files. At home, his priorities came clear and fast. Build Canada homes. Billed as doubling the pace of construction and the largest housing program since the Second World War. Tax changes to shift burdens across incomes and capital gains. Removing federal barriers to interprovincial trade, and fast-tracking big projects across energy, artificial intelligence, critical minerals, and new trade infrastructure.
Is a rounding error. The CUSMA compliant, no, come on. The CUSMA compliant is, for example, for Canada, it's more than 97% is CUSMA compliant. It's effectively the same thing. It's just more straightforward. We did it that way.
These weren't presented as scattered promises, but as a set of moves meant to reset how Canada grows internally and positions itself globally. Housing stood as the centerpiece. Carney framed it as a mobilization effort, not just a policy fix. The rhetorical choice, that this was the largest plan since the war, intentionally carried weight. It suggested the issue wasn't just about affordability, but national capacity and collective urgency. The underlying pitch was simple. If government can give families a fair shot at home ownership, then Canada earns the credibility to act with confidence abroad. In his telling, a sturdier middle class makes for stronger negotiating power on the world stage. That framing raised questions the press didn't have to say out loud. Can Canada really confront a housing crunch of that scale while also carrying a bigger global role?
We've got about 2 journalists left and just a little bit of time, so
Yeah, sorry,
keep it short, everybody.
I will take all the time that's necessary so that both can ask their questions. So,
Captain.
sorry, my apologies.
Can one agenda cover both without risking overreach? Carney's answer was to fuse them, insisting that domestic renewal and international credibility weren't competing priorities. They depended on one another. When he turned outward, Ukraine sat at the center of his international points. He described the war as a test of democratic resilience, one where Canada's role mattered as part of a coalition. The detail was direct. Canada is one of the leading trainers of Ukrainian troops, already contributing methods and manpower in support of Kyiv's defense. He avoided inflating Canada's influence into something it wasn't.
The decisions in the budget will come out on November 4th, so we're looking at a variety of things across all aspects of government.
Instead, he said Canada would do our bit, stressing reliability and partnership with allies like the UK, rather than posing as a substitute for absent US leadership. That balance shaped the broader tone. He acknowledged Canada wasn't the power to tilt the entire conflict, but Canada would step in where it could, keep pressure where it mattered, and show up consistently. His analogy drew on hockey again. Canada as the enforcer, not the superstar, not the player making the winning shot, but the one ensuring space, protection, and presence so the team could perform. For Carney, that applied equally to defending global norms and to defending Canadian households. The symmetry was deliberate: promise security at home, contribute toughness abroad, but layering both big housing pledges and costly international commitments invited attention that lingered. Was this clear-eyed leadership that connects every level of policy, or a strain on resources and credibility that voters might see as stretching too far? That unresolved question is what Carney carried out of London, setting the stage for a new kind of posture.
Ça, c'est le permis. OK, d'accord, merci.
Canada isn't playing cautiously anymore. In London, Carney signaled an unapologetic shift, presenting Canada as willing to carry its own weight and throw elbows when needed. The performance left little doubt about his message. Ottawa intends to act with force, not retreat into polite restraint. For Canada, the choice cuts two ways. It can chart a more independent course in a fractured world, or risk sparking backlash by leaning too aggressively into confrontation. Type strength if you think Carney was right to push back, or overreach if he risked too much, and explain why in one line. If you want more clear-eyed Canadian political analysis, subscribe to Canada Connect today.